Welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for this THE and conversation looking at Australian and New Zealand universities in the time of the pandemic. I'm John Ross. I'm Times Higher Education's Asia Pacific editor, coming to you from an attic in Sydney's eastern suburbs. And of course, this pandemic, it's put every industry through the ringer. Certainly higher education. Nobody knows what it's going to look like when this is all over. And to the most strident critics of universities, they're actually quite happy about this. They think that universities are bloated bureaucracies that are only interested in feathering their own nests and pursuing their woke agendas that have no relevance to ordinary people. And to the most ardent enthusiast of universities, it's a complete catastrophe. It's going to undermine our futures as knowledge economies, and we can forget about any hope of developing a vaccine for the coronavirus. Look, we've assembled a panel of some of the sector's most objective insiders to hunt for the truth between those two extremes. In no particular order, we have Gigi, a Professor of Economics at UNSW Sydney, just where I am now. Dave Gearon, who's the writer and the analyst with the Tertiary Insight news service in Wellington. Andrew Norton, a Professor in the practice of higher education policy at the Australian National University. And Tamson Pietsch, she's the Director of the Australian Centre for Public History at the University of Technology, Sydney. Now, look, I'm really stoked that people of this calibre agreed to be on this panel because there's serious intellectual horsepower here. Gigi was Australia's Young Economist of the Year last year, abiding interest in higher education, and has done some very, very influential research in the area that journalists are very familiar with. Dave's been on the scene for more than 20 years as a policy advisor, an analyst and a lobbyist in tertiary education in New Zealand, knows it inside out, and is not afraid to call a spade a shovel. Andrew, the guru of higher education policy in Australia, first port of call for any journalist covering any sort of story to do with higher education in Australia. And Tamson, a Rhodes Scholar and an expert in the history of universities, and she's also hosting a UTS podcast series on universities in the time of the coronavirus. It's called The New Social Contract, and it's really worth a listen, so I recommend it to you all. Please make the most of this branch trust that we've assembled. The Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screens, use it to send questions. But look, I'll get us started. This session this afternoon is mostly interested in international education, its prospects and the ramifications if we see a really serious downturn. In Australia, the signs aren't all bad. There's some bright signs as well as some dark signs, and there's a lot of them, so I've made a list. So on the plus side for Australia, we've had this surprisingly good management of the pandemic. So much better in that respect than most other countries. We're now gradually opening the economy, which is a good thing for international students, among other people, because it means they can earn a crust and keep a roof over their heads, hopefully. We've had this patchy but largely pretty decent hardship support that's come to international students from the universities and from the state and territory governments. People are now talking about at least conditional reopening of the borders to international students. And then, of course, there's the things that have always been going for international education in Australia. It's a very nice place. It's mostly safe. It's a good place to work or migrate. We've got some very well-regarded universities, and the dollar is relatively low, which helps to moderate costs. But on the minus side, we've had some serious reputational impacts from the federal government's treatment of international students during this crisis. The economy hasn't opened up all that much yet, so there's still a lot of international students without work. The campuses haven't opened up very much yet. The borders haven't opened up at all. We have a lot of international students doing study online at the moment, and some of them no doubt thinking, this is not such a bad way to do things, I might stick with this. And quite a level of grievance that they're being charged full dollar for doing online study. And then, of course, the things that have always gone against Australian international education. It's relatively expensive. A lot of students have these perceptions they're being treated as cash cows. Some classes are very skewed towards certain nationalities, particularly Chinese. We have quality problems with some of our university courses here, particularly around language skills. And we have these geopolitical tensions with that very important source market of China. They've just reared their head again. So there's a lot of problems there as well. Tamson, you've been looking at a lot of these issues, through your podcast series. How do you see this panning out, the prospects for international education in Australia in the short and the medium term?
Thank you, John. But it's always dangerous to ask a historian about the future. But I do think that, one of the things the situations we're facing is one where the settings of the immediate past are not the referent point necessarily for the future. And historians have the virtue of at least working with societies based on very different social settings. I think it's pretty clear that we're probably going to face some form of restructuring of the higher education system in the near future. And what that means for international students is just not known yet, I think. But we have seen the kind of, I think everyone here is going to agree with me to say that the kind of the settings of higher education policy in Australia have been really probably frayed for some time now, and it's time for a remaking of that social, what we're calling the social contract between kind of universities, states, and their publics, which include, of course, industry. So I think what we have to remember is that always happens within a global as well as a local context, and it's pretty easy to talk sometimes about what the Australian version of that relationship is. But as we know, knowledge is one which it does transcend borders, although it's produced within them. And we need to remember that our universities are deeply entangled in regional and international economies, as well as local ones. So my sense would be that those are the kind of building blocks to keep an eye on as we're thinking about what's going to roll out in the next 2, 3, 4 years.
So, Andrew, is it a case of Australia maybe doing less worse than some of our competitor countries?
Well, I think we've got to start with what is going to be the global level of demand for higher education in the future. And I think if we look back in history, for example, the global financial crisis saw a dip in the growth rate of internationally mobile students, but didn't actually cause the numbers to go down. So we've got history showing that even in bad economic times, these aspirations for higher education remain pretty high, particularly in China and India and other sort of middle income or developing countries. So the question is, to what extent can Australia take advantage of this? I think one short-term advantage is the one you mentioned, that Australia's got COVID-19 under reasonable control, and certainly much better than the UK or the US, two of our main historical competitors. But as you said, there are a range of other issues about whether Australia has somewhat damaged its reputation. So the Prime Minister, when asked about the situation of international students and temporary migrants early on in the crisis, essentially said they could go home rather than stay in Australia, rather than give them access to welfare in Australia. So that was some quite bad messaging. But I believe over the long run, the scale of demand for international education is so high that Australia only has to get a reasonably small share of that to have a very successful international education industry. But it may well take 2, 3, 4 years to get back to roughly where we were, say, last year.
Gigi, you're in a university that's highly cranked on international students. I go there for my coffees, and I saw a big difference early this year when there were clearly much fewer Chinese students there than you would normally see. How do you see things panning out?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Well, I mean, just as Tamson said, you might not want to ask a historian for a forecast, maybe not an economist either. But I think that this will hit particularly those sub-disciplines or disciplines where international education has been very strong, and those include economics, business generally, and engineering. And that will happen in the short run at least. I mean, there has been talk, for example, of having a trans-Tasman bubble of, protection from COVID-19. I actually think that's a non-starter in a longer run way, but if that continues to be on the agenda and gets implemented such that we have border controls that prevent international students from coming here, that certainly doesn't seem as appealing as, for example, going to the US or the UK or other competitors. So I do think in the short run, universities are scrambling to figure out what else they're going to do. And as Tamson said as well, the policy agenda in relation to international students was already a bit rickety going into this. And in particular, there was conversation about diversifying the sources of international students. We have such heavy reliance on Chinese students in particular, and I think that will only continue now. There's also, of course, a huge push to provide education online, as you mentioned, and that looks to continue through the end of this year, at least, in terms of offering either online or face-to-face to try to be as flexible as possible. We have words like omni-channel delivery being bandied about, trying to meet students where they are. Now, of course, that has sometimes visa implications. If you offer only online programs to people, then they can't get a visa to come here. So it's a very different world for sure. I do think that it provides an opportunity for a restructuring, and I've been talking for years about how Australian universities actually have a much better position than they think they do, it seems, in relation to being able to develop a high-profile elite English language program for students from Asian countries or generally our region. And that hasn't really been taken up as an opportunity by any of the universities I've seen, particularly successfully, and I think this would be a perfect time to do that. Remember, higher education industry in China is already, way beyond where it was 10 years ago. We are not going to be able to keep riding that boat forever, and I think we should more and more push towards trying to be the provider of elite English language programs in the region.
Dave, the situation in New Zealand is quite similar in many ways to Australia, but also has its differences. New Zealand's arguably managed the coronavirus even better than Australia has. I think there's definitely a perception that the national government in New Zealand has treated international students in a more favourable way than Australia's government has. And of course, you have a far lower proportion of international students to begin with. So is this shock going to be much less of an issue for New Zealand universities than it is for Australian universities?
I think it will be less, but only a small amount less, because the universities rely upon the international market as much in New Zealand as they do in Australia. Much as I like to claim New Zealand's better than Australia in most things, I think in this case we're within a few percent of each other. I was having a look today, and the number of cases and the number of deaths and so on are within 5% of each other, I think. If you're looking per capita, which New Zealand always does because it makes us look better normally. But I also saw we're down to one case at the moment. There is one active case of COVID-19 in New Zealand as of 9 a.m. this morning. So, and we haven't had one for a week. So, a new one. So we are starting to move into a stage where we can talk more about recovery and more about shifting into a more open phase. There's still a lot of fear around that, but we're starting to get into that stage of, can we talk more about getting students back into the country, international students. But in terms of the impact upon universities, they're talking about across the sector a $500 million downturn in income, which in the size of the New Zealand sector of 8 universities is significant. It's mainly around our Chinese students, as with Australia. The ban on travel came in around the time that many of them are coming through to New Zealand, coming through to study. So our other students are in a better position. More of them are in New Zealand.
Mm. So that financial hit that you talked about, $500 million, it's roughly 10 times that across the Australian sector. And that's just this year. There was a study that came out of the University of Melbourne this morning suggesting that things are going to get worse over the next 2 years in particular. I mean, we could talk obviously all day about international education as a discrete industry, but I guess the thing I particularly want to focus on is the implication for universities. Andrew, you did some modelling last week which looked at how much Australian research is directly bankrolled by international students' fees and came up with a figure of around 27%, about $3.3 billion or so. I'm wondering if this is a zero-sum game. If we were to lose that $3.3 billion that we get from international students, does that mean we lose $3.3 billion of the research that contributes to Australia as a knowledge economy and sort of buttresses its standard of living?
Look, I think it definitely does mean that this several billion dollars at least of the $12 billion that Australian universities spent on research in 2018 is at jeopardy. Like, we're not going down or losing all of that straight away, but over the next few years, that is quite plausible. We'll lose a large share of that. So I think, like, it's very hard to see a path out of this where we don't have substantially reduced research activity in Australia, just because we've been running a system that has relied on large amounts of discretionary revenue, which principally comes from international students.
We often hear about the multiplier effect of university research. The Group of Eight produced a figure, $6 worth of economic benefit for every dollar that's spent on university research. That obviously that modelling was done by a consultancy. We all know that consultants are pretty good at coming up with the answers that the people who hire them are looking for. How seriously should we take these sorts of claims of this massive multiplier effect of university research and the economic flow on benefits?
Look, I'm always skeptical of this kind of analysis. And I think the reality is, it's very hard to say. It's not just any research that delivers huge benefits. It's probably only a relatively small number of projects end up generating very big returns. And so a whole lot of research is not aimed at any kind of commercial outcome. And even when it is aimed at a commercial outcome, it may not be successful. So I don't think there's any kind of one-to-one relationship between revenue lost and benefits lost in the end. I guess one of the issues will be, though, when universities decide that they can't afford the research they're doing now, how do they phase down what they're doing? And so a lot of sort of the loss of the broader benefits will depend on what kinds of research is phased down. Now, Australia, like other countries, is a very heavy bias to medical, science, engineering kind of research, which probably are the ones more likely to produce practical benefits. But we'll just have to wait and see how the universities tackle this. For me, the danger is that we lose staff based on the nature of their employment contract. Are they on a fixed term contract about to expire soon? Are they on a casual contract? Rather than a more strategic phase down according to the importance of the research.
Tamson, is that something that worries you, that not only the employment basis of academics, but also their disciplinary interest could dictate their futures, and we could really see a reshaping of universities based around those sorts of things?
Yeah, I think that's deeply concerning, as is the loss of a sort of cohort, a generation of scholars who will be increasingly necessary as universities join in, and we are all going to have to join in the fight to mitigate climate change effects and build societies that are resilient to them. And I think it's those, and that fight has an aspect that requires both technical and medical expertise, but also I think is much, much broader and is around the kind of social, as well as the ways meaning is made around the changes that our society is going to confront. And I think, as we are thinking about what a restructuring of research on the one hand and teaching might look like, it's really crucial to bring that imperative right into the middle of the discussion, because the kinds of universities our society really needs in the 21st century are not going to look like the kinds of universities necessarily that we had in the 20th century.
Just going back to the earlier conversation about the prospects of international education, we've had a question come through from the Q&A button, essentially asking, is there no optimism for Australia and international travel and testing and quarantine, and no second wave of the disease? So the sorts of optimistic scenarios that have been talked about, could we actually have more students in 2021 maybe than well, I don't know if this person is suggesting that we might have more in 2021 than we had in 2019, but could we do a lot better than a lot of people have been forecasting?
I think there's a danger here in sort of thinking about how we calculate these numbers. So even if commencing students bounce back very quickly next year, we'll still have people who would have been first years in 2020 who won't be second years in 2021 or third years in 2022. So there is this pipeline effect. And so we would need an extremely big commencing cohort next year to compensate for the 20% or so of students who are supposed to be here in first semester who are not, and the even larger number who are supposed to start in mid-year who probably won't be able to get into the country. That even though we're talking about quarantine and things like that for students, I can't see how we're going to get tens of thousands of people through that process by the end of July.
Back to the research that's bankrolled by this income stream. Obviously, we've been talking, I suppose, particularly about research that has a direct economic benefit, but there's lots of other spin-offs and lots of other reasons for doing research. It's a constructive outlet for the intellectually curious, and it gives professors something to do, and thirst for knowledge for its own sake. It's sort of it really seizes the imagination of everybody in society. This is something we were talking about before, Gigi. If we lose the means of bankrolling all that sort of activity, how much do we lose as a society, and how important is that sort of activity to us as a society?
It's extremely difficult to put a number on that. Obviously, you've touched on some of the effects. I think having a research sector in which you can draw the interest from people who are PhD educated from around the world, the best researchers, the best thinkers in their disciplines, who can come to Australia and establish training grounds for the next round, the next generation of PhD scholars, is a mark of a very developed, civilized society that is likely to be peaceful, thoughtful. It is the way to raise Australia up, partly from the anti-intellectual history that it has had in parts compared to some of its peer nations. And I think so it isn't just about having something to do for professors. And remember that, in relation to which research is really useful, take an example. For example, my 2012 paper about international students. Now, that paper was just essentially a commentary on what's going on in international education in Australia. You could say it didn't have any direct economic impact. How would you measure the impact of something that, is out there in the public debate? Many of the things journalists write about in their articles are not technical, engineering, solar power related or medical science related discoveries. They are things from the social sciences. They're ideas, new things from business, new things from psychology. And those things make a difference to what we talk about and how we talk about it. Asking why things happen, why is the world the way it is? That is the mark of a society that's developed today. And if we give up research, we lose that. Now, I would also say it's a bit of a straw man or a red herring to say if international student revenue goes down, then oh no, what will we do? How can we possibly sponsor research? There are many options. One of the problems we'll face is that the recession we have now created will cause a reduction in all sources of income for the government and therefore expenditure on any line item, including research. But there are other ways that you can establish funding for and support for research. And that's another direction in which universities, even before this crisis, were moving towards philanthropy, which is of course one of the sources of bankrolling research and education in North America, which is one of the reasons that they're able to have such elite institutions over there. So I do think that it's very important to have research for a variety of reasons. Can't easily be quantified, but we can certainly think about the reasons. And I do think that most investments into research and development fail, and that happens at university level as well. So we have to be willing to accept that. It happens in the private sector and public sector, and really the public sector may be the one to take more of the burden of shouldering the research investments going forward.
But you would think that the pandemic is going to remove discretionary income from the commercial people who bankroll research and the philanthropists. So, it looks to use perfect storm.
No, the impact of a recession is huge. That's one of the reasons I've been railing against it in the media on that topic recently, is because it impacts every sector potentially, and you know, GDP falls of 6% for 6 percentage points. That's nothing to sneeze at. That's a really big hit. And if we do want to find savings in universities, you know, I could think of a few places where we could cut, and they don't have to do with academic staff.
Yeah. Yeah. Another question from Mark Robertson this time. Presumably there will be a reduction in ARC and NHMRC funding as the federal budget is tightened. What does the panel think about this, and what knock-on effect does this have on universities' funding? And will the channeling of funds by these and other funders then affect research at the universities? So do we have that sort of domino thing happening?
I'm not sure whether they will be cut. The government's already had a bit of a go at the ARC in particular in the last few years, but I suspect they will see that that is still a valuable program. But the trouble is with those grants that they're never fully funded anyway. And so one of the reasons we actually need to have international students who generate discretionary revenue is because government competitive grant projects are only partly funded, and therefore universities need to seek other revenue sources. So the two things are actually intertwined quite closely.
Dave, what sort of effect do you see these sorts of problems as having on research in New Zealand? Is it a similar scenario to what we're seeing in Australia, or are there different sort of factors at play there?
I think I'd agree with Andrew on the point. I don't see a major change in research funds in New Zealand, because government is mainly pumping money into the economy and finding any project that it thinks might help employment and help boost demand around the economy. And they're not really looking to cut things at the moment. They're still shoveling money out the door. Give it a year or so and they might try and save some money. The main thing coming through in New Zealand is around the fears, which will be the same as in Australia, around staff on casual contracts and fixed term contracts, the emerging researchers coming through the pipeline, people on postdoctoral fellowships and so on, and people, you know, getting those extra projects to get them by. Those are the people who are most at risk because they're the easiest to cut. They're likely to have the least secure employment arrangements and the shortest term and so on, and no large redundancy costs involved in terminating their employment. So that's the real risk, is that those people are most, you know, vulnerable in the system are likely to be lost. And there's you know, pressure groups forming in New Zealand around that to try and promote their interests right now. But I've got another point. When it comes up, there's a point. Someone made a question about social license, but we'll go into that when you're ready.
Oh, okay. That point on, you know, sort of the prospects for casual and fixed term employees, there's a lot of talk about that in Australia too. And there was a paper that came out a couple of weeks ago that made a point that we risk losing a whole generation of you know, young postdocs here. I mean, I've got to say, if I was looking at the prospects, do 7, 8, 10 years of education and emerge into such insecurely paid work where you can't start a family, buy a house or anything like that, doing so much to gain so little in a private sense, and then have all of this coronavirus impact piled on top of that. Is there a real risk that in New Zealand and I suppose also in Australia that we may just lose a whole cohort, years and years of people who just decide it's just not worth the risk?
I think there is a risk, but obviously the advocates for those people are going to overblow the risk, and we've got to come somewhere in the middle and find the result. But universities are going to have to decide in the next few months too around whether this is a blip this year and whether they're going to be able to get back to, you know, normal enrollments, whatever they might be, in semester 1 next year. If they think that it's going to come back to normal, that they think they get the student flows back in February, then they won't take such large cuts to their costs right now. They'll decide they can wear some of it. And that's probably the biggest one. And we won't know that, I think, for another few months. And everyone will be gaming that out, trying to work out how much of a hit they'll take this year and how long it will go on for.
One motivation for research, which we haven't really talked about, rankings. New Zealand doesn't get as much money from international students and hasn't been doing as well in global rankings in recent years as Australia has, just in terms of its relative position. Australia's been surprisingly buoyant in the international rankings, in the years since 2014, when our big, really research-intensive, comprehensive universities really started going for broke on international dollars. Are we going to crash down the rankings now? Is New Zealand going to have a harder time maintaining its place in the rankings? Is Australia now going to experience the slip down the rankings that a lot of journalists have been predicting for a few years now? And if so, does that really matter to the wider research community and to the benefits that research brings us? I mean, maybe starting with you, Dave.
I think there will be an impact, but it's hard to know how widespread that impact will be. Some nations may do better. Some of the Chinese universities may do better out of this. They may be less affected, but all the universities across, the larger universities across places like New Zealand and Australia, Canada, the UK, US, and so on, France, Germany, are actually all going to be affected by this. So it's not going to be a one-off problem, I don't think. Certainly there'll be an issue, but I don't know if it will have a huge impact or whether it will trigger enormous changes. It's just even though we're 3 or 4 months into this now, it's still too early to tell on many of these issues. We've just got to prepare for different scenarios and hope for the best.
How do Australian commentators see that this whole trajectory of rankings going and affecting universities and society more broadly?
So I think Dave's point is a crucial one, that rankings are by definition all relative things, and because even though Australia will have a decline in research output, so will all our competitors, because they're all affected by similar trends. Now, one of the benefits of rankings for the universities is they believe this helps attract particularly Chinese students, who are the most lucrative international students. But you could argue that this has been a bit of a perverse thing, that they're all trying to be top 50 or top 100. It's mathematically impossible for every university in the world to be top 100. And really, maybe the university should be focused on, more strategic priorities than simply where they are in the Shanghai Jiaotong rankings, which is, a bit of a vanity project.
Look, we've had a related question from Kristen Sadler, saying the international allure may suffer in the next year or two post the pandemic, but what about in 10 years? Are the factors which created the allure for international students and researchers before the pandemic still going to exist in 2030? So I guess you were talking about the so-called virtuous cycle of rankings. Rankings attract students, which attracts money, which enables us to improve our place in the rankings. Does the whole thing turn around, and do we sort of zoom for the ground under this current scenario?
Or we go for, I guess the rankings are a big thing for the Chinese market, but they're not such a big thing, for example, the Indian market, which is a far more price-sensitive market. So if we do go down in the rankings, it's not going to affect the entire international education industry. I'm sure Indian students are interested in rankings, but it's clearly not the major driver of their behaviour. As I said, I think there's been the rankings have had a somewhat perverse effect on university behaviour, and maybe we could all decide that they are less important due to this situation.
Another thing that international student dollars has bankrolled has been a complete construction boom, at least on some of the big Australian campuses. I can see the cranes from my window at UNSW. Tamson, do you think the construction craze in Australian universities is now over? Has it had its day?
Yeah. I think that's one of the infrastructure projects are one of the things universities are cutting first, certainly in the immediate context of the immediate crisis, cash flow issues. Whether that will resume or not, I think is in some part perhaps tied to some of the questions you've been talking about around student experience. I would actually I think this question about international rankings is probably also linked to the question of the social license. And I'd love to kind of hear a kind of other panelists' reflection on that, because, you know, where does a university get its legitimacy from? What is its constituency? And I know Gigi earlier was sort of perhaps referring to how that might be changing anyway. And it does feel that that is a kind of pivot moment whereby we need to think about what the kind of local constituency is and what the social license is locally and how that intersects with a regional presence. And obviously buildings, I mean, I think just to answer the question on buildings, I think sometimes if vice chancellors would have been mad not to go for the international student boom, right? Like it was a gold rush. So you dig the gold out of the ground, but then the question is, where do you invest it? What do you do with it? Do you put it towards operating costs, or do you put it into endowment? Or perhaps buildings is not a bad place to put some of that revenue, because at least it sticks around. So I don't know whether the building craze is necessarily such a bad thing. I think a lot of the infrastructure assets were in very bad repair after sort of decades of not being looked after. But we've got a different question now, which is about what our universities are really for and who they serve, I think. And some of the answer to that is the region. So I'd love to hear what Gigi has to say.
Please.
Just to take over your chairing role, sorry.
So I agree very much with the comments about rankings having potentially perverted the direction of universities strategically. And we also have to think about what it is that really drives rankings. Many ranking systems very heavily weight the academic staff qualifications and the number of publications in particular journals like Nature or Science. It's possible to target those areas in a university with the remaining funds that there will be available for research and other activities, even with the decline in international student fee revenue. So I think if universities really want that, they can get that, you know, via expenditure choices. But if you wanted to get my vote for how universities should scrimp and save in the coming months and years, in order to meet this revenue shortfall. Here at UNSW, as you may know, the VC and a lot of the top brass took a voluntary 20% pay cut. I think that's a great step. I think, you know, we've been paying VCs far too much money for far too long in this country. Absolutely shave off the top. There's a huge layer of middle management and a huge layer of, you know, marketers and people who spin stuff, who sell things, rather than people who actually create the service that the university sells, which is teaching and then research. And those layers have been bankrolled in part by the international student fee revenue. So I think another area of opportunity for Australian universities is to get rid of some of those layers, undo so much of the red tape, undo so much of the sort of spinning of you know, specialty new websites and hiring consultants to come up with new names for various faculties. I mean, that stuff it's frivolous and it's a luxury good that we can do without. So I would like to see a return of the university to its true core service to the society in which it is, including to the world, but in particular the society that it's constructed in, and the domestic students and research related to developing its own society that we sort of have in the back of our mind as the ideal for universities.
That's been a call. Stephen Parker, the former University of Canberra Vice-Chancellor, is now a consultant with KPMG. One of his main points has been we really need to cut some of this questionable activity, as he sees it, in universities. Is it really likely to happen? Are these sorts of things bolted on? And I mean, if it does happen, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. People who rely on those jobs just as much as academics rely on those jobs.
Very true, and we're going to have to see a repurposing of labor from sector to sector in other places other than universities. I mean, think about the tourism industry, for example, hospitality in Australia. Many very, you know, precariously attached people who are part-time workers or casual workers, they're going to be struggling right now. So how about some of those white-collar workers as well, would be the argument. And those people, you know, they can go and get other jobs just as easily as the young people, if not more easily, because they have some experience under their belt on average. We're talking about, you know, a 35-year-old working in a marketing department at a university. That person, I would expect, will be better off than the 22-year-old, you know, trying to get a job right now, who doesn't have any experience pocket. So I think, yes, you have to think about these people as people, and there was an element of local charity in having those sorts of humongous departments of marketing, and huge middle management layers anyway. But local charity has to be pared back just as much as other aspects of our spending when times get tough. So I agree, and I think the government, if they wanted to, the government could in fact try to help particular segments of the workforce that'll be affected, and that would also include casual academics.
Dave, you mentioned social license before. What did you want to say about social license?
Well, I think it sort of ties into the quarantine issue, really, and about getting international students back in. And I was talking to a colleague today in New Zealand and saying that the polling that they've been following had shifted from people being concerned about health issues, the health of themselves and their family, towards economic issues over the last 6 weeks or so. It had very, very weighted towards concern about health. Now it's shifting more towards economic. And the same thing is happening in Australia from what I can see. But there's still a large amount of fear around, particularly people coming from outside. Even if Australia and New Zealand do clear up COVID-19 within the country, everyone's still worried about people coming in and that. And so I think there's a lot of work to do by the university sectors in both countries to build trust in the wider community and with your Prime Minister, it seems too, and ours, to take a move to allow students to come back in. And that will be involving quarantine and everything else. But there's a big trust issue there. And I think because we've necessarily created fear in our communities to deal with a very scary potential, of this virus. And taking that fear level back down for people is going to take time. And that's going to manifest in various anti-migration views. It's going to getting people back into the country, allowing them to have work rights. Work rights may well be restricted over the next year, particularly as people are, as we have high unemployment. So there's a lot of stuff to think about how the self-serving interest of getting international students back to a pre-existing level is going to hit a lot of concerns in the community about their health and their jobs.
Presumably, building trust over something like that would take quite a bit of time if it was possible to do it at all. And the timeframes that people are looking at here are relatively short. They want people here for the third trimester or the second semester or whatever. Is it really feasible to build that trust with either the broad constituency or with the politicians?
I think it is, because I think that there is a high amount of trust. And I think in Jacinda Ardern and Scott Morrison both seem to have had a boost in popularity out of this. And I know there's ups and downs and all that, but there seems to be a fair bit of trust in what they're doing, because both countries are heading in broadly the right direction on health issues. So if they decided to do something, the other thing is about social license, yes, but political will. Politicians have got a lot of power right now. They're spending money, like crazy, and we're not, up in arms like we normally would be of saying, oh, you're spending on that and that and that. So if they decided to push for quarantine and promote that to the community in an effective way, then I think they would achieve it. But I don't think it's a high priority enough right now for them.
I was wondering if we could look a bit at the motivations of students for coming here and the implications for this brave new world of online education that people seem to be talking about. Foreign students obviously come here to learn, but they come here for a lot of other reasons as well, even if it's just the joy of living in another country, hanging out with other young people. And of course, very much in Australia, there's people who are motivated to come here for the opportunity to work or to migrate. You can't do any of those things sitting on your laptop back home in Bangalore or whatever. I'm just wondering what the panellists think about the potential of this experience. From what I can see, a fairly positive experience on the whole of learning online, whether that's going to make a major change to the way people have habitually done international education over the last 20 years. Will it radically change? Or will we revert to type where people really like to go to another country and experience that other country?
I don't think it'll make a big difference. So, the technology of online education has improved enormously over the last 20 years. But from the point of view of Australian universities, they've actually got fewer international online students than they did at the start of the century. And so very clearly there's a strong preference among international students to get this kind of international experience. And I guess, you know, if you are prepared to do online, there are probably cheaper places closer to home that you could go to instead of an Australian institution. I think this is generally true to the domestic school leavers. I think, you know, education is not just learning stuff, it is meeting people, having a whole lot of other experiences. And therefore, I'd say online and on campus are slightly different products. And the on campus, I think, will still be very, very attractive in the future.
We've got a question along the same theme from Edward Buckingham. We obsess about rankings and research, but surely our biggest value proposition is the opportunity to immigrate. Where do you see this evolving in the years ahead? So I'd be interested in perspectives on that for both Australia and New Zealand.
Let me start. So again, it's kind of different markets in Australia. So for example, in Australia, there's a 2-year visa, the 485 visa you can get after you finish a degree. And what we see is that Indian students and Nepalese students are very, very interested in this visa, but the Chinese much less so. So even though Chinese students outnumber Indian students, Indian graduates outnumber Chinese on the 485. And so if, as Dave suggests, there are changes to migration rules, the visa is restricted or capped in some way, that may well feed back through to demand for Australian higher education, just because one of the benefits of coming here, which is 2 years full-time work or 3 years if you've done some degrees, won't be there anymore.
And Dave, do you see a radical change in the immigration proposition for students going to New Zealand?
We'll see. I mean, I agree with everything Andrew says. I often do, actually, but I think it'll take a few more months. I mean, obviously the border's closed entirely at the moment, unless unless the production team for Avatar films, the next couple of films, is coming over from Hollywood in the next week or two. But other than that, no one else is really getting into the country. So, and I don't know when it will be opened up again. Because New Zealand and Australia are playing a strategy of, we're going to be an island, we're going to get rid of this virus internally, and then we're going to open up at some stage. We've got no idea whether that strategy will keep us closed for 2 years or not. We might have quarantines for international students, but if we stay closed, then we're still not going to have a tourism industry if we have to have a 2-week quarantine for people. And so we're still going to have huge unemployment and various problems. And in that market, it's very hard to offer work rights to graduating students or students while studying.
We've got another related question, probably this time for the economist on the panel, and I've just managed to lose it from my computer and from my phone. Look, it was about skilled migration. That sure, international students love to come here, or some international students love to come to a country like Australia or New Zealand for the opportunity to immigrate. But they're also a very important source of skills to countries like Australia and New Zealand. How do we see that equation going? Are we likely to turn off the tap for some skills that we really, really need as an economy?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it gets to the heart of the issue, which is that Australia is a very heavily internationalized country. We trade heavily in normal times with the rest of the world. We have heavy immigration, and to simply imagine that we can close borders and just wait until some future uncertain moment to open them again and things will be okay, that we can press pause like that and not create massive economic problems, is fantastical, which is why I've been arguing in the press very strongly that we actually should never have had a lockdown, and that we should, as quickly as possible, move into a public mindset that we need to open our economy back to as much normalcy as we can, see this virus as a really nasty virus, but one that mainly picks on the old, which is true, and the immunologically compromised, and try to work on building Australian resilience rather than trying to hide away in our houses. So I think Dave is absolutely right about this. It's a very uncertain and impossible moment, really, for Australian higher education in terms of trying to predict when we're going to be able to get these international students back. And the same thing goes for migration and tourism and everything else. And so this is why I said at the beginning that it is just a non-starter in the medium run to imagine that we can keep our borders closed and go on business as usual. Now, I do think what will probably happen in the short run before this uncertainty is resolved is there will be more conversations about how to potentially invest in and grow skills domestically that we used to be importing more. And I would love to see coming out of this more emphasis on TAFE and other similar, applications-based further education beyond secondary school. I think that sector has deserved more attention for years, and the universities have gobbled up that attention like a nasty older sibling. And it would be very welcome for the economy as a whole to see more emphasis and more status awarded to degrees that come out of those sorts of apprenticeships, trades, and other kinds of practical education, because we could use it, and we've got the ability to do it if we choose.
That's a fairly common refrain, and of course we had the job maker scheme, the latest version of the job franchise coming out of the government the other day, which is very much focused on technical trade training. Do you think that might be the start of a better deal for the vocational education sector in Australia?
Boy, I hope so. I really hope so. I've seen so many students come through the higher education.
Do you think?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I hope that that's true. I've seen a lot of students come through the higher education sector in Australia in my career who should not have been here. They should have been in trades, in art, in music, performing arts, which of course is also a sector that's taken a major hit, but many other areas of human endeavor where they were better suited. And because of the status problems, mainly, they were pushed either by their parents or by their own sense of self-worth or something to go to university instead. And I think that's a tragedy for everybody involved. It's a tragedy, right? As an economist, you want people specializing in their areas of comparative advantage, and there's nothing worse about being a bricklayer than about being a university professor as a professional identity. We need them both. So I hope we can move to more of a dialogue about that and trying to uplift the technical and further education sector for sure.
Dave, do similar inequities play out in New Zealand? I know Fees Free has been very much focused on training as well as the higher education sector. Does the New Zealand technical training sector feel like a poor cousin to higher education? And if so, could this situation with the pandemic change that?
Well, it always does. I mean, there's parity of esteem issues in every system in the world. But the latest budget, the government has put a lot of money into tertiary education, but very little of it is going into the higher education sector. Most of it's going to the vocational education sector. And a lot of that is actually going into what seems to be wage subsidies for apprentices to keep them employed. About a third of it, it seems. So yeah, the university sector has actually got very little out of the budget. It spent $1.6 billion extra, and the universities mainly got a cost of living adjustment and the ability to have extra domestic places funded next year.
I want to move to another area about the money supplied by international students and the effects of that money. So it's clear that international students cross-subsidise universities, and the refrain is always that there's no deleterious impact on domestic students in having international students because they don't take the places, they pay for the places. I'm wondering clearly international students pay for new buildings, they pay for research programs. I'm wondering if it's true that they actually bankroll places for domestic students. And if it is completely not a zero-sum game, that when you bring in a lot of international students, there is no impact on your capacity to bring in domestic students. Because certainly in some of the big Australian universities, we've seen numbers of domestic students going down, just as the numbers of international students have been going up very dramatically. There may be all sorts of reasons for that, but I'm just sort of wondering, particularly, I suppose, Andrew, your perception about these sorts of questions and that balance?
Well, I guess one of the things about the demand-driven system that we had until a couple of years ago was that there was no longer any minimum number of domestic students that universities had to take. Now, on my analysis, none of them actually shrunk, except the University of Melbourne, the undergraduate level. So they kind of maintained their domestic numbers, but their growth was really on the international side. And so I guess the counterfactual is, if they didn't have these lucrative internationals to go for, would they have been keener on the domestic market? And, you know, and would more students have gotten into the more prestigious universities? The argument against that happening is that a lot of these universities are prestige orientated. If they take Australian students, we'll hear about the ATAR. And if they're forced to expand and take students with lower ATAR, that undermines their prestige claim. And so I think there are more reasons than just the money why some of these universities have been reluctant to expand their domestic student numbers. I guess the big test, though, will be in the next few years, where we may well get some increased funding for domestic undergraduates. We'll have all these vacant spots in lecture theatres that international students are not taking. And so will universities say, well, we've got no choice but to increase our domestic student enrolments?
Tamson, just wondering if I can ask you from a broad historical perspective, going back all the way to Bologna or whatever. I know some of our universities here have become fairly close to being majority international students. I know Michael Spence at a recent summit overseas was saying that his governing body was very conscious of the potential of that happening. If that were to happen, would that meet with your understanding of the social license of Australian universities? I mean, obviously, some institutions like London School of Economics are majority international students. Would such a thing be acceptable for a comprehensive Australian university?
My sense is that universities are Janus-faced in that they have to balance their commitment to their local contexts with a kind of relationship to the frontiers of knowledge, which is an international social license, right? They've got to be able to retail in, teach and research at the forefront of knowledge development. And research and international students sort of sit in that picture. So it's about weighing those different constituencies up at any one time, and an institution has to continually balance that. And I think we're in a period here where given the Australian system, which is quite different to the British system in many respects, although obviously there's a lot of similarities, I think Britain is deeply embedded into a kind of European network and a transatlantic network too, and a kind of LSE particularly has a lot of connections to the former empire. That Australia at its cost turns too much to the international. And I think there is a question here about publics and what they will demand of their institutions. And we might be in a period of overcorrection, but I think what the place will come back to won't be the same place that we left. And the long history of the university has seen that iteration over and over and over again. So I don't think this is the first moment where all of that has had to be renegotiated. But I think if we look to kind of the next 2-3 years as a time when the world will go back to the way it was, we might be making some strategic mistakes in terms of an opportunity to kind of rethink how our higher education system will be structured.
We're just about out of time, unfortunately, but I'm wondering if I could go to the other panellists. I guess there's been a lot of talk this afternoon about seeing this whole crisis, as with any crisis, you always turn a crisis into an opportunity, as an opportunity to reboot, to change things, ultimately for the better. I mean, potentially, we could be in a scenario where we may come out of this horrible crisis in better shape than if we hadn't had it. What's your feeling, Gigi? Is it one largely of optimism or pessimism around whatever changes are going to flow from this crisis?
I'm certainly optimistic about several aspects. I do hope that we will find a refocus on the core business of universities, which is research and teaching, and very, very well put by Tamson, actually. This compact with the local constituency, but linked in with the international community of researchers, and providing a service to the world as well as to the local people. And certainly, I'd love to see less top-heavy institutions in terms of the governance structure. I'd like to see more voice for the professoriate. That does require the professoriate to stand up and demand it, because the people in charge do not provide that easily. So I don't know whether they're prepared to do that. In the history that I've been working in the sector, professors are extremely cowardly when it comes to political fights. So I kind of don't expect it, but I do think there's an opportunity there. And I also think that it's very possible for, and would be maybe seen as profitable and therefore feasible politically, for universities to target a higher quality product in the international student market. I'd love to see that, because I think it would also take some pressure off of the problem with international benchmarking standards that we've had. In terms of our assessment, design, and just, the problem with English language proficiency in Australian universities, which has been massive. I think to try to target a higher price point and a higher quality product would be an opportunity that's much more financially feasible than re-empowering the professoriate. And I think it would also be good for everyone involved. So it's a win-win situation.
Andrew, opportunity for a quick reboot, do you think, or a positive reboot?
Look, I think the net effects will be negative, but recessions, in economics, recessions have advantages in getting rid of low priority, inefficient enterprises, and maybe in the university sector, it will be a more sharply focused, organised system afterwards, with greater focus, as Gigi says, on the core things that universities should be doing.
And Dave, net positive or net negative?
Oh, negative, but I'm optimistic that soon we'll get back to the same old debates that we always have and can argue about the same split of resources and so on. But I am pessimistic about the thousands of people across our two countries who will lose their jobs as a result of this. But I'm positive that while we tend to report and total up lost jobs, we don't tend to report gain jobs in ones and twos and tens that do actually occur when. And the way that our university sectors in both countries have grown over the last 10 or 20 years, we will still be well ahead. At the end of this year, we'll be well ahead of the employment we had 5 years ago, probably, in the universities. That's my hope. And I hope we improve that again.
It's a great point to finish on. Look, thanks so much to Gigi, Dave, Andrew, and Tamson. I can't believe the time's run out so quickly. Thanks to everybody who tuned in and sent questions. We'll be publishing this webcast shortly and continuing our coverage of the coronavirus impacts, which is obviously the main game for higher education journalists at the moment. It's not behind the paywall. Please check out our news site at timeshighereducation.com. Also, please keep an eye out for other virtual events that Times Higher Education is holding. You can look at the events section of our website. We have THE Live Asia coming up on the 3rd of June. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye and stay safe.